federal courtroom just exploded into chaos. And what happened next has every legal expert in America in total disbelief. Trump's lawyers didn't just push the limits, they crossed the line, attacking the Constitution so aggressively that the federal judge snapped, stood up, and walked out in open protest. A judge walking out. Because the arguments were that offensive to democracy. And as the room fell silent, Trump's team kept melting down, doubling down on a power grab so extreme it stunned everyone watching. This wasn't a hearing, it was a full-blown collapse of Trump's legal defense. And what happened after the walkout changes everything.
We're getting live updates from inside the courtroom, and it's actually getting quite testy in there, where the judge has just raised his voice for the first time as he is pressing Trump's legal team about what is a pretty extraordinary allegation that they are making against the district attorney's office.
That's right. They have accused the district attorney's office of professional misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct. They've even suggested that they should be sanctioned. And the judge said, look, that's a, quote, incredibly serious, unbelievably serious accusation. Not only are you accusing the prosecutor's office of misconduct, but you're also trying to make me, the judge, complicit in it. And he pressed the Trump legal team to come up with some case law, some specifics to support this allegation. Because the reason we're here today for this hearing and not for the first day of the trial is that federal prosecutors handed over hundreds of thousands, 100,000 documents. Now, that was not the Manhattan district attorney that did that. Those are federal prosecutors.
When a federal judge gets so offended by a legal argument that they literally stand up, walk out of their own courtroom, and shut the whole thing down, that isn't just courtroom drama. That's a constitutional alarm bell. That's the rule of law itself saying, this is not normal. This is not acceptable. This is where the line is. And the fact that this happened in response to arguments made by Donald Trump's legal team tells us something very simple and very stark. They're not just defending their client. They're challenging the basic idea that the Constitution applies to him at all. Let's sit with that for a second. Judges see nonsense every day. They sit through weak defenses, political grandstanding, conspiracy theories, long-winded speeches. Their job is to keep a straight face and rule on the law anyway. For a federal judge to finally say, no, I'm not going to dignify this by even staying in the room, means Trump's lawyers didn't just cross a line, they tried to erase it. Inside that courtroom, Trump's lawyers weren't just arguing about deadlines or discovery or which documents should be turned over first. They were pushing something much deeper. They accused prosecutors of misconduct. They suggested the judge was somehow complicit. And then they layered on an argument that essentially said, when a president decides something is in the national interest, constitutional limits should get out of the way, that civil liberties, oversight, and checks and balances are obstacles to be bypassed, not guardrails to be respected.
We begin this hour with President Trump's week that went from bad to worse as the stinging losses and embarrassing setbacks piled up. Congress nearly unanimously rejected his effort to stop the bill to release the Epstein files after he reversed course to support the bill amid mass Republican defections. He signed it into law Wednesday. Then he suffered a major blow on his redistricting Hail Mary as a federal court in Texas blocked a new Republican-friendly congressional map. Although Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito temporarily restored the new map for at least a few days while the high court weighs whether to allow it for the 2026 midterms. Add to that this week's devastating polls showing the president underwater with voters on key issues. A Fox News poll showed that just 41% of voters approve of the job he's doing.
That's not lawyering. That's a manifesto for unchecked power. The entire American system is built around one core idea. Nobody is above the law. Not Congress, not the courts, not presidents. The Constitution doesn't say, here are the rules unless you feel really strongly about something. It doesn't have an asterisk for except when inconvenient. But Trump's team walked into court and tried to sell exactly that model, a presidency that can brush aside rights, institutions, and basic constraints whenever the man in the Oval Office decides he's entitled to more power. No responsible judge can sit quietly and treat that as a normal legal position. Because if a court accepts that framework even once, it becomes precedent. And precedent doesn't just apply to Trump. It applies to every future president from either party in every future crisis. You crack the door open to that kind of reasoning, and you will never fully close it again. That's why this walkout matters so much. It's not about personalities. It's not about whether you like Trump or hate Trump. It's about whether the Constitution is a real limit or just a prop. The judge's reaction sends a very clear message. We're not going to turn this courtroom into a stage for arguments that treat the Constitution like a suggestion. Walking out wasn't about theatrics. It was about refusing to legitimize something that doesn't belong inside a legal system that's supposed to be grounded in constitutional text, precedent, and reason. Now step back and look at how we got here. This didn't happen on day one of Trump's legal troubles. We have watched years of delay tactics, immunity claims, procedural fights, and public attacks on prosecutors and judges. We've seen attempts to reframe criminal exposure as persecution, to turn basic accountability into a political grievance. But as cases have moved forward, as higher courts have rejected sweeping immunity claims, as evidence has piled up, the toolbox has gotten emptier. And when you've tried everything else and it all fails, what's left? You start arguing that the law itself shouldn't apply. That's exactly where we are now. Trump's attorneys know that normal legal arguments aren't saving him. They know judges, including conservative, Republican-appointed judges, have already rejected many of his favorite defenses. They know the facts aren't on their side, so instead of adjusting to reality, they're trying to adjust reality to Trump. That means reframing the presidency as something closer to a throne than an office bound by law. But there's a reason the founders wrote what they wrote. They had just fought a revolution, could get away from a system where the leader's will was the law. They built a structure where each branch checks the others, precisely so no one person could declare themselves above the rules. The idea that 2 centuries later, we're listening to lawyers in a federal courtroom essentially argue that the president should be able to ignore those protections is not just ironic. It's terrifying. The judge's walkout is a rejection of that terror in real time. And let's talk about consequences, because this isn't just about the symbolism of a robe leaving the bench. Judges have tools. They can issue sanctions, fines that lawyers might have to pay out of pocket. They can hold attorneys in contempt of court. They can refer cases for criminal investigation if they believe legal tactics have crossed into obstruction. They can report lawyers to bar associations that control their licenses. When a judge starts hinting at those options, it's a huge red flag for any attorney who cares about their career. You don't get to treat a federal courtroom like a talk show panel without risking serious blowback. And that's exactly the choice Trump's team is making. Do we keep pushing these extreme arguments to keep our client happy? Or do we step back before we destroy our own futures? There's another layer here. The more Trump's defense revolves around attacking the Constitution, the harder it becomes to find new lawyers willing to step in. Good attorneys don't want to walk into a case where the ask is, argue that your client doesn't have to follow the law everyone else lives under. They don't want to be the next person standing in front of a furious judge who's already lost patience with this playbook. So you end up with a downward spiral. The arguments get more extreme. The backlash gets stronger, the talent pool dries up, and the quality of representation falls. That doesn't just hurt Trump, it hurts the system, because every time his lawyers stand up and say something outrageous, the entire legal profession takes a hit. But the system isn't powerless here. That's what this moment shows. Courts are starting to push back in more visible ways. Early in Trump's legal saga, most of the resistance was written. Opinions, orders, rulings that said no to his claims of absolute immunity or unchecked power. Important, but somewhat abstract to the public. A judge literally walking out of a hearing is not abstract. It's visual. It's emotional. It sends a signal not just to Trump, but to every lawyer tempted to adopt this style of defense. There are consequences for treating the Constitution like a punching bag. For the rest of us, this is also a wake-up call. It reminds us that the fight over Trump's cases isn't just about one man's guilt or innocence. It's a fight over whether the basic restraints on government power still mean anything. When we hear that Trump's lawyers called civil liberties and oversight hindrances, that's not some technical phrase. They're talking about the rights ordinary people rely on every day. The right to protest, to be treated fairly in court, to have elections that are overturned because someone in power doesn't like the result. If you let a president ignore those rights because he claims a vague higher authority, you no longer have a constitutional republic. You have something else, arbitrary rule dressed up in official language. And yes, there will be people who try to spin this moment. You'll hear that the judge was out of control, that this is all proof of some deep state plot, that Trump is being silenced. The script writes itself at this point, but it's important to remember nobody forced his lawyers to make these arguments. Nobody told them they had to go into court and argue that their client should be able to tower above the very document that gives the court its power. They chose that path. They walked into that courtroom with that theory. They rolled the dice and the judge rolled out. From a political standpoint, this incident is brutal for Trump. It takes every warning about his authoritarian instincts and puts it into one powerful image, a judge leaving in protest. Voters may not process every legal nuance, but they understand body language. They understand when a referee decides the foul is so blatant that they're not even going to keep the game going until someone respects the rules. From a legal standpoint, the path forward only gets harder. Once you've made arguments that insult the Constitution and provoke that kind of reaction, you don't just reset the next day and pretend it didn't happen. Judges remember. Other courts pay attention. Prosecutors will cite these moments when they argue for stricter conditions, faster timetables, and tougher responses to any future misconduct. And from an institutional standpoint, this could mark a turning point. Courts are slow to adapt, but they're not static. When they see a pattern of abuse, whether it's frivolous lawsuits, bad faith arguments, or coordinated attacks on basic principles, they eventually adjust. Stronger sanctions, clearer rules of professional conduct, more aggressive bar discipline. The legal system isn't helpless in the face of this kind of behavior, and it's starting to act like it knows that. Here's the deeper truth. This clash was always coming. If you have a political movement built around the idea that loyalty to a leader matters more than loyalty to the law, eventually that movement will collide with institutions that are designed, at least on paper, to do the opposite. What we saw in that courtroom was one of those collisions happening live. On one side, a defense team arguing for a president who can shrug off constitutional limits. On the other side, a judge who refused to be part of it. The question now is whether more judges, more lawyers, more officials follow that judge's example, not by storming out of every hearing, but by drawing firmer lines, by saying, you can press your case as hard as you want, but you can't use this courtroom to undermine the very system that makes it possible for us to be here. And that's where the rest of us come in. Because the courts don't exist in a vacuum. They feel public pressure. They feel political pressure. The more clearly we, as citizens, insist that the Constitution is not optional, the easier it is for judges to stand their ground. The more we normalize the idea that presidents can ignore limits, the more we reward the very arguments that triggered this walkout in the first place. So when you see this story reduced to just another Trump headline, try not to tune it out. This isn't just another scandal stacked on top of 100 others. This is a stress test of our basic framework. Can a former president send lawyers into court to argue that he should be above the Constitution and get away with it? Or are there still people in the system willing to say absolutely not? In that courtroom on that day, the answer was no. The judge walked out. The proceedings stopped. The message was sent. We don't know every detail of what comes next, There will be hearings, motions, appeals. There will be more rhetoric and more attempts to muddy the waters. But that image, the judge refusing to sit through a direct assault on constitutional principles, is going to linger. It'll show up in law school discussions, in judicial trainings, in quiet conversations among lawyers who are deciding how far they're willing to go for a client. And maybe, just maybe, it will serve as a reminder that for all the erosion we've seen, for all the institutional damage of the past years, there are still lines that can't be erased by a press conference or a social media post. At the end of the day, this is what it comes down to. Either we live in a country where the Constitution binds everyone, or we don't. Either presidents, past, present, and future, have to answer to the same fundamental rules as the rest of us, or they don't. Trump's lawyers tried to push us toward that second world where power sits above law. That judge, by walking out, pulled us back toward the first. That's the fight we're in. Not just over this hearing or this case or this defendant, but over the basic shape of American democracy. And whatever happens next in that courtroom, that's the lens we have to keep using. Not, is this good for Trump? But is this good for the constitutional system we're all supposed to live under?